Lord, I just want to thank you for any opportunities to share the truth that belongs to you. And I just pray that you will bless our discussion and may it be fruitful for all of us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So as I don't know, Mr. Liebert, or I don't know if I've met you before, but I appreciate you sharing about your experience with Piaget. And a lot of you probably have a lot of knowledge and information that I would love to hear from you all about, because maybe you can contribute things you've learned over the years. I feel like a newbie in some ways to, I guess there's always something we can learn, right? So, I mean, teaching about psychology, it's humbling because, there's always things we can learn, right? So anyway, I'm just going to share from my own professional experience, at least, working with people and my own life experience, because that's all I can do, right? So I'm going to share this PowerPoint here. And I also have some videos. I don't know if I have some videos that I found on YouTube, but I'm not sure if it's copyrighted. And so I don't know if it's legally, are you able to reshare it? You know what I mean? So what would you prefer? Should I just skip it or include it?
No, just go ahead.
Okay.
By the way, let me introduce you just for a moment, interrupt you for just a moment here.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Several people have been saying that their chat was disabled. I have not done anything. Something is going on strange here, and I apologize to those of you to whom it said your chat is disabled. Lynn said it happened to him, and Art said it happened to him. Something going on, nothing to do with me. I'll try to troubleshoot it as we go on here. So Thomas, go ahead. You've got as much time as you want, and yeah, just go ahead and share whatever you have, and I'll. We are recording just the.
Okay. All right, and you can always edit in post-production. Okay. All right, so this is how faith changes across the lifespan. I did share with you I think I passed on a document if you want to read more details and references and things like that on the subject. I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view overview. We'll just mainly discuss. I don't want to get too caught up in the details because it may be too much for to trying to get through in one or 2 hours. How long are we going to be here? Is it just 1 hour? Is that right? We're just what's our time frame? I want to be respectful of time. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, you can talk for about 45 minutes to an hour or something like that, and then
we'll have some time
keep
afterwards.
Discussing. People will really join in on this one. This is something people are really interested in.
Okay.
We'll get a lot of discussion out of this. Again, people are still telling me that their chat is disabled. I didn't do it, folks. I'm trying to fix it. There's been a change in the chat thing, and
oh yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, it is. It's kind of new to me too. Some of the new features I'm not used to. So, all right. Well, anyway, okay. So I'm going to start off with just an introduction about myself. I don't know how much you guys know. I did a degree in theology. My PhD is in marriage and family therapy. I'm licensed as a marriage and family therapist. So because of I have a background at least as a part-time pastor and associate professor of psychology and counseling at Washington Adventist. Today, I am a lead director for my practice, which I'm currently hiring for. So we are actually in the expansion phase of my practice, higher change. So I do a lot of work with families primarily right now. That's what I'm doing. So anyway, let's talk about what we're talking about. So first of all, what we're not talking about is we're not talking about how do people get converted or how people change their faith. Okay, and that's a different subject. Okay, we can have another talk about that. What we are talking about is assuming that somebody stays the same faith or same religion throughout their life, how would their faith change? Okay, so that brings up the difference between what is known as nomothetic versus idiographic development. So, or changes. So nomothetic is basically the normative experiences that everybody pretty much goes through, right? Like most everybody is going to, go through school, maybe get married someday and have children. I mean, maybe not everybody, but most people are eventually going to have a family at some point, because research shows 90% of people will eventually end up getting married at some point in their life. And then we all die, right? So, I mean, that would be nomothetic. Idiographic would be, well, some people will end up some people go to college, some people don't, some people end up divorced, some people don't. And those are really major changes that can have an impact on your life, right? So those are things that you can't account for, that are not generalizable to all people. They may be very unique to you. They may be very profound, but they're still more unique. Same thing applies to faith. So, for example, it's hard to talk about faith development in some ways when you have people have such majorly different experiences with their faith. Like somebody might have gone through a major conversion experience from one religion to another. Somebody might have been in a cult and came out of that, or somebody might have lost their faith because of experiences that they've gone through. So that would be more idiographic, and it's, we can talk about that, but that's going to be highly unique to the individual. Everybody's journey is different in life, to be honest. Everybody's journey is different. But if we were to look at everybody as in some commonality, if we were to look at the commonalities between all of us, and assuming that we are not making major life radical changes, like change in religions, how would our faith typically progress? And so that's what we're looking at today. Does that make sense, what we're talking about? We're talking about the nomothetic, the normative ways people grow in their faith, right? Any questions about that? Okay. Let me check the chat just to see.
Just go on, and we'll take the questions at the end.
Oh, at the end. Okay.
So just kind of barge on ahead, Thomas.
Okay. Sure. All right. So why it matters is that, well, many of us, we are involved in parenting or training children. So we definitely want to care about how do children develop, but not just children. We also, especially those in church leadership or any healthcare leadership, we are concerned with how people of all life stages are growing and developing. And we also care about ourselves. We go through our own changes, and we want to look at how we grow and develop. And you might look back on your own life and look at how you have changed yourself. So no one is ever really staying the same. We're constantly changing. So this is a question. We can discuss this at the end. I did have some discussion questions, but if you prefer, we can talk about it at the end. I'll just throw this out more as a rhetorical question to at least think about. Okay. So let's just think about this for yourself. When you think of how faith changes, what would you choose to measure? Right? Just think about that. If you were to think about how you would study the subject of faith and how it changes, what would you look at? Would you look at people's religious practices, whether they go to church or not? Would you look at their behavior, interpersonal behavior, for example? Are they moral? Or would you look at their beliefs about God, right? Do their beliefs change? Or would you look at their more emotional experience of how people feel connected to God? In other words, the question I'm asking you to think about is, how do you operationalize faith? Basically, the word operationalize for researchers, means how do you quantify it or how do you measure it? How would you measure faith? Obviously that's a really important theological question too. Well, oftentimes in the church, we're discussing that as well. What is faith? Faith is the evidence of things unseen, right? Well, how do you operationalize that? And in practical terms, so if you were to talk about these things in terms of religion, spirituality, and morality, what are those? What do those mean? So I just want to differentiate briefly before we continue on. Religious and spiritual are oftentimes used as different adjectives in our society today. People will say things like, well, I'm religious. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, right? You might hear people say that. I'm not into organized religion, but I am spiritual, right? It's very popular for people to say that. But can you really divorce religion and spirituality? What is religion anyway? Religion, you might say, is the way you organize your beliefs about the world you live in, and the transcendent. And spirituality is definitely connected to that. You really can't divorce the two. According to Pargman in his book on integrating faith and counseling, he talks about this. There's this bifurcation that people arbitrarily divide between religion and spirituality, but you really can't differentiate them. Everybody has some kind of religious beliefs. Even atheists have religious beliefs. So you just can't divorce them. But if you wanted to talk about how you operationalize it, at least religion might be thought of as the practices, the external practices that we show to the world, whereas spirituality might be thought of as, and I'm just using this, don't quote me on this, but I'm just telling you from my understanding of it, spirituality might be thought of as the processes, the more psychological processes that are involved in helping us feel connected to something beyond ourselves. Morality isn't really, well, if you think about morality in terms of values, everybody has values, right? Whether you agree with religion or not, all of us have values, and we're constantly teaching values and inculcating and transmitting our values to other people. What morality comes into play when we're trying to decide between competing values, or when we have values in conflict with each other. Then it's a matter of how do we come to decide the right and wrong. And so morality might be seen as a subject of discussing our ethics, or how do we come to determine right and wrong. And so all of us are going through life deciding, making decisions related to these things. And we are always growing in our understanding of these things. So I mentioned in the slide already, we talked about spirituality is more about our meaning, connectedness to others and the sacred and that sort of thing. As I mentioned, morality is about, how do we determine right and wrong, and then maybe based on our values. So now we just talked about some of the terms. Let's talk about the faith development theories. How do we grow? How do we change in our practice and application of things like that? And how do we define faith, first of all? So if we take a look at this from a moral perspective, some people look at it from a moral paradigm, right? Morality in terms of our values, right? And so they would think of how do our morals change as we go through life. And one person, as we talked about in our pre-discussion, was Jean Piaget. And Jean Piaget took a cognitive approach to human development. He was interested primarily in human intelligence. He started, I believe, in working with intelligence testing, and wanted to understand why do people change? How do people grow cognitively? So when we think of, just so you know, when we talk about cognitions and cognitive development, what we're really thinking about is the thought processes and the ways that our brains think, right? Not necessarily, we're not talking about emotions and stuff like that. We're talking about thoughts at the higher level. And so that's one way we're talking about here. How do people grow intellectually? Okay, so before we talk about morality, you have to understand where Piaget was coming from and his approach to cognition. Okay, so for Piaget, he came up with these 4 stages of cognitive development, starting at birth up until beyond adolescence. So he would say, and I'm just going to show you this video, but I'll give you a brief introduction. The first stage is sensory motor. That basically means that babies and toddlers are first learning to understand their senses and develop the motor skills. So that's the very first thing that they got to learn in life. That's even before they learn to speak, right? I have a 2.5-year-old. He's got a little speech delay, but he's starting to pick up some of his words. But his primary goal for the last couple of years was just learning to walk and understand the world. Now, though, he's switching. He's starting to pick up his vocabulary, and that's switching to the pre-operational thought. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Someone wrote on the. Okay, there you go. Thanks. So the pre-operational thought, that's the stage when language explodes. Now, my son is starting to pick up words and he's speaking more, using, babbling, talking, mama, mama, right? No, right? That is pre-operational thought. They're not yet in the realm of logical thinking yet. They're not logical at this point. That's why it's called pre-operational. Operational basically just means logical. So they're pre-logical, pre-operational thinking. But this is a time period in which the language is exploding, okay? Then as they get to middle childhood, they're able to engage in some basic logical thinking, just more concrete logic. That's why it's called concrete operations. They're not at the higher level yet of abstract reasoning that involves math and sciences, abstract thought, but they can talk about fractions and anything that you can look at concretely. I'm going to show you this little video.
Piaget's theory argues that we have to conquer 4 stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. Second, the pre-operational stage. Third, the concrete operational stage. And fourth, the formal operational stage. Only once we have gone through all the stages, at what age can vary, we are able to reach full human intelligence. 1. The sensory motor stage, ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop through experiences and movement our 5 senses. Our brain wants to see, hear, smell, taste and touch as much as possible. First, we start with simple reflexes, and soon after, we develop our first habits. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond our own body. And then as we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget terms, our realization of object permanence. Before that, our mum can show and then hide a teddy, and we would think it's gone. After, we understand that objects continue to exist.
Okay,
even
I'm not going
when
to show
we
you the whole
can't see
video.
them.
It's because it's long. I'm not going to show you the whole video. But we want to cover other things. But it was just, at least the introduction part was kind of cute. It shows you the different stages. So just to recap, the first stage is the sensory motor stage. And when it comes to morality, Piaget probably wouldn't apply it yet to morality much until the second stage. The second stage is the pre-operational thinking. And this is when children symbolically represent their external objects through symbols. And this is where words start to develop. Now, when it comes to morality, this question comes up a lot. And I think in my discussions of theology, people talk about the selfishness of children, right? Have you heard people talk about that? This idea that children are born selfish. right? Well, I don't know if I would use the word selfish. I would say the word egocentric. Egocentric basically means that children can only see the world through their point of view. Okay. So they can't understand that, that you have a different perspective. They can't step out of their perspective. There is an example of, let's say you're talking to a child on a phone. They can mimic you, which is fine, but they can't understand that you're going to have a different experience on the others. Like for example, I was just talking to my sister yesterday who was having her birthday, and my son was trying to talk to the phone like as if she could see him. Well, we do have FaceTime, but she wasn't on FaceTime, right? So he can't understand that she can't see him, right? That's because he's not able to see things from her point of view. So we naturally have an egocentric perspective of the world. We have to learn to think about the world through the perspective of others. So when it comes to morality, children are egocentric. They have a hard time cooperating, and they will follow rules simply because of the consequences. All right, when it comes to concrete operations, they're able to engage in logical reasoning, but more on a concrete level. And so that's let me show you this example. This is actually a historical video that illustrates.
Can you look at these two glasses? Do you think that they have the same amount of juice? You think they have the same? Okay. Now we're going to pour this juice into this glass. Now, do you think that this glass has more juice, this glass has more juice, or do you think that they have the same amount?
That one has more.
This one has more, and why do you think that this one has more?
Because it's taller.
All right, so this is a good
First, we're
example
gonna look at
of
these two
conservation.
cups right here. Do you think there's the same amount of juice in this glass as there is in that glass?
They're even.
They're even? Okay. So we're going to take the juice from this glass and pour it into this one right here.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to look at this glass and that one. So do you think that there's more juice in this glass, more juice in this glass, or do you think that they have the same amount?
Same amount.
Okay, why do you think that they have the same amount?
Just because this is skinny doesn't mean it's not the same amount. It has the same amount.
All right, so that's basically the principle of conservation. Children at the older child was able to understand that just because it changed shapes doesn't mean it's more. So that she's able to engage in concrete logic. Now, at this age, when it comes to morality, morals are more rule bound. There's a little flexibility to adapt to situations. And so they're just more rule based. And so, yeah, that's middle childhood. Now, when we get to adolescence, adolescents are able to think more abstractly and engage in abstract logic, critical thinking skills, basically. And with that comes the ability to think more critically about morality. So rather than basing morals on rules, they're able to think more, as Piaget would say, autonomously. So in the beginning, there's two stages of morality according to Piaget. The first stage is heteronomous. That would basically imply a concrete approach to morality, or he called moral realism. Okay, autonomous morality simply says that rather than other people telling us what to think, or that morality is determined by external authority figures, that now we can decide for ourselves that, wait a minute, other people may not always be correct. That in fact, multiple people might have some truths, and it's a matter of me deciding which one I want to do. So this is more moral relativism. And so the idea is that morality is more relative to the situation. So naturally, he would argue that we go from more concrete approaches to morality to more relativistic approaches. That was Piaget. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. Some other people did some research on how cognitive approaches apply to prayer. And it's interesting. There's 3 stages according to Long, Elkind, and Spilka. They look at elementary school children's perceptions of prayer. And so this is cognitive approaches still. And they said the first stage, they have vague associations of prayer with terms like God, God bless, now I lay me down to sleep. Again, you can kind of see it's more about the rituals. And prayers are oftentimes more egocentric, like they'll pray for candy and toys and they thank God for the food that they had. But it's more egocentric. The second stage is that now they start to see as, well, it's not so internal, that it's more about transmitting a message, right? And it still can be routine and external. But the problem though, is it's still concrete. So remember concrete logic, is that God has a limited capacity to answer everybody's prayers at once. I remember thinking that as a kid too. Like, how does God get to listen to my prayer and someone else's prayer at the same time? He can multitask? That's beyond me. All right, then stage 3, oops, I think that meant ages 7 to 9, not 97. All right, and then stage 3 is when we're starting to get into more abstract thinking. So they start to have an abstract understanding of prayer and so forth. But basically, the point is, as children grow, they become less egocentric, right? More thoughtful of others. They start to pray for others. And prayer becomes less of an unemotional ritual that they do before meal times, but they actually start to use it as a way to cope with the stresses of life, right? And of course, the spirituality will be much more deeper and satisfying. Okay, so that's Piaget, and Piaget is primarily a cognitive approach, right? Now, and it was primarily interested in how people resolve conflict. But I want to move toward Kohlberg. Lawrence Kohlberg, what you would say, builds on the cognitive approach, but he was much more interested in the idea of moral conflicts, right? The abstract level. So in his research, he used the Heinz dilemma and asked young people how they would respond to this, or ask people how they would respond to this problem. And I want you to think, so this, I guess we're not doing discussions till the end, but I want you to write down or just think about your own answer, okay? How would you answer this challenge? Because the way you answer it would basically tell you where you are in your own moral development, okay? So I'm going to read it to you, but I want you to think about your answer. I'll give you some time to reflect afterward. In Europe, a woman was near death from cancer. One drug might save her, a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The druggist was charging $2,000, 10 times what the drug cost him to make. It was basically some companies do today, right? They charge a lot of money to make a profit off of suffering. Isn't that horrible, right? So the sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could get together only about half of what it costs. So he said, his wife, is near death. So he told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said no. So what should her husband do? Should he steal it? Should he just say, okay, try to push him? What would you do? And, similar ethical questions are oftentimes raised when, you hear people talk about like, okay, you're in the Holocaust and you're hiding people in your basement, right? And the Nazis come to your door and asks you, are you hiding somebody, right? And what do? Do you tell them the truth? Because and Christians are supposed to tell the truth, but the downside is that, people get killed. On the other hand, do you lie and protect life? But then the lying, would be breaking a commandment, right? So that's oftentimes another kind of question that people use, basically a moral dilemma. That's kind of a dilemma we're talking about. So what do? Do you tell the truth? Do you abide by the rules? Or do you look at the larger principle? So so what would you do in that situation? Okay. Just think about it. I'm going to check in with the chat, see if there's anything. Okay. But I want you to think about that. What would you do? Okay. All right. Now, so Kohlberg developed a theory that said that we progress through stages of moral development. It's interesting because in the early days of Freud saw morality as a conflict of unconscious forces, and they saw morality as more as a result of non-rational feelings. But here, there's trying to say that morality is actually more at a conscious level. And he was interested in how people consciously resolve their conflicting values. Okay, so 6 stages he came up with, it basically summarized into 3 levels. And I really like the 3 levels. That's the way I like to look at it. I don't like to get into the nitty gritty of the 6 stages, but because, I don't know how fruitful it is, but let's just look at the 3 levels. Basically, there's pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional levels. Okay. And you could further refine those 3 levels into 2 stages each. So that's where you get 6 stages. Okay. But I don't want to inundate you with information. So I'm just going to stay with the 3 levels. So the first level is pre-conventional. Pre-conventional is this idea that morality is in external bad acts, not in the person, right? It's based on rules and consequences. Okay. Now, when if you think about children, they're oftentimes think about they don't want to get disciplined, they don't want to get in trouble. So if you ask them to apologize, they're going to apologize because they got caught or did something wrong, right? That's a pre-conventional stage. Conventional is when they start to understand that there are other people. They start to empathize with other people, right? So now they understand, they approach conflicting values as a member of society, and they're fulfilling the expectations of others and the group norms. Adolescents, they still go through this very much. So morality is oftentimes about performing a role correctly to maintain order. Okay, so they're inculcating the values of society, right? And while you might think, well, adolescents, they don't do that, they're beyond that. No, adolescents are still very much in this mindset of like whatever their group says. Okay, they might have a group, but they still follow the group. It could be about what their political party says or what their faction of the church says, right? They're going to repeat the sound bites of the party or group that they belong to. Okay, so that's still conventional thinking. Okay, it's still about what other people think. And at least they're considering the norms of other people, but it's still very much going along with what other people think. Now, post-conventional is when you're moving beyond that. You're seeing beyond the norms to some universal ideas and principles that society is based on. And they're able to think out of the socially prescribed solutions. They're going to challenge and critically think about what people say. Well, I don't know. Like that sounds like that's, they might say, oh, well, it sounds like a good answer, but let's think about this more carefully, right? So that would be post-conventional or principled. Now they're thinking beyond what other people say, and they're looking at principles that go beyond what is expected. Okay. I'm going to skip this video just for time. So Kohlberg would say the last stages are more theoretical, but the reality is that we never really fit neatly into one stage. In fact, we probably go back and forth on some of these stages. Okay, so that's cognitive approach. The next big one, which I really like to share about, is the more psychoanalytic view. Okay, and so Erikson was a neo-Freudian psychoanalyst coming after Freud. They were very much interested in the unconscious forces. The difference with Freud, Freud was very much into the psychosexual development. Freud had posited that children grow in different stages of oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. But Freud was all about how drives that are innate to us push us to do things, right? Like, obviously there's a sexual drives and things like that. But the neo-Freudians weren't very fascinated with Freud's approach to sex, okay? They were getting rid of all that. So a lot of the more modern psychodynamic people are more interested in what Erikson was focused on, which is the more psychosocial aspects of development. So Erikson's model is known as the psychosocial approach. He came up with 8 stages of psychosocial development, okay? And Erikson's whole approach was how basically our thoughts about ourselves, like shame, can impair us or impede our development from one stage to the next. So just take a look at the left side. The left side is the positives that we want to develop. But on the other hand, if we don't accomplish this goal, then we will have the right side. So the first goal of infancy is to develop a sense of trust. If that isn't attained, then there will be mistrust. Okay. If you think about infants, the first thing that they do is they attach to their mommy, they attach to their daddy, and they develop a sense of security and trust in their parents that they're going to be around. Then the next stage is autonomy. Then there's a sense of initiative, industry, identity, which we'll talk about, intimacy, generativity, which is basically for middle adults, we like to give back to society, leave a legacy. And lastly, older adults, as they face the end of life, they want to hold on to their ego integrity versus despair. So let me just break down a few of these items because I really like this theory. It's not perfect, but it has a lot of implications, which I want to talk about. Okay, the first one is that according to, there's 3 takeaways I want to look at from Erikson. The first one is this role of secure attachments in infancy. Okay.
So you've probably seen a little.
I want to share with you this. This is I can't remember what his name, Matt Green. He's going to share with you a little experiment that was done by Harlow on rhesus monkeys. And it's really interesting what you would expect. So according to Freud, let me just share with you the experiment. So Harlow did this experiment where he set up a wire monkey, which is basically just a little monkey made out of wires, and another monkey that was made out of wires, but they put a cloth over it. The wire monkey, they put a bottle of milk on it, and the other one, it was just a fuzzy cloth, but no milk. What they wanted to see was what would the baby rhesus monkeys gravitate toward. According to Freud's drive theory, they would expect that the rhesus monkeys would gravitate toward which one? If it's drive-based, what do you think it would be? It would be toward the one with the bottle of milk, right? Because it provides something. But lo and behold, they discovered that the rhesus monkeys gravitated not toward the one they expected, which had the bottle of milk, but toward the one that had the cloth, the fuzzy cloth on it, covered it. It wasn't about milk. Let me just share. Well, I'm not going to show you the video because I just explained it now. But basically, the point was that unlike Freud's theory, the monkeys actually preferred some connection. And that speaks to the power of attachment. Now, So attachment theory accounts for our comfort with emotions. And there's a story you might have heard of Emperor Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor from way back in the Middle Ages. And he conducted brutal human experiments. One of them involved raising infants. What he wanted to do is figure out what would happen if we raised infants in isolation without talking to them. What would happen to the children, right? What language would they speak? And what do you think would happen? Well, they failed to thrive. They didn't live. Babies need human touch. We now understand that babies need human touch for growth and survival. If they don't feel loved, they're not going to grow. And so that, it reminds me of a passage in the Bible, in Genesis 2, it says, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." We were created for relationships. We're not meant to be alone. In fact, loneliness is more deadly than smoking, as we now know. We need connections. Not only does it help us emotionally, it also protects us literally. Like if you've heard these people going off into the wilderness by themselves, they're more likely to get eaten by a bear or have a boulder fall on them and then they can't escape, right? So we need that buddy system. We need each other for survival. And I think that's what God created us in his image as relational beings. And that says that God is a relational being. So anyway, the attachment theory, as John Bowlby says this, their propensity to make strong emotional bonds to particular individuals is a basic component of human nature. We are all created for relationships. And according to attachment theory, there's two basic benefits that we get out of a secure attachment. One is that secure attachments create a secure base from which we can operate from. If you think about in the war, right? On the front lines, you have a forward operating base. That forward operating base enables you to proceed and move forward in the battle. And it gives you that safety to explore and move forward. On the other hand, when you hit challenges and you fall down, you have somebody you can go back to. And so that secure attachment provides a safe haven, somebody can go back to, right? And I think this has very important implications for us spiritually as well. We know, for example, that our image of God is oftentimes influenced by our image of our parents. If we have a good relationship with our parents, we're more likely to have a positive relationship with God. On the other hand, if you had a bad relationship with parents, you're probably not going to be very connected to your God. It can be overcome. I've had to deal with that in my own life, but it's certainly one of the challenges that we have to deal with. So Mary Ainsworth was a protege of Bowlby, and she conducted this strange situation experiment involving children. Basically put a child in a room and had a parent come and go to see how the child interacted with the parent when the parent left and then came back. And Mary Ainsworth came up with these three classifications about insecure versus secure attachment. I like to think of it this way. I came up with this theory when I was in 6th grade. All of us are like dogs and cats. That's the way I think of it. What's the difference between a dog and a cat and their personality? Do you know? Like, do you have dogs or cats, right? Which one is more likely to be clingy? Like when you leave the house, which one's going to be at the door, scratch, 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 and when you come back, scratch, scratch, waving their tail. Cats, probably not so much. More like the dogs, usually the dogs. Now, there's always some exceptions, but dogs are a lot more clingy, right? Cats, on the other hand, they want love and affection on their own terms, right? They're going to lounge around like when they want affection, they'll come for it. Same way with humans. Some of us are more like the dogs. And according to Mary Ainsworth, they would be the more preoccupied, anxiously attached. When there's any kind of insecurity in the relationship, they're going to cling harder. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the cats. Okay, so when there's any kind of insecurity, they're going to pull away and protect themselves. Those are the cats. Someone needs to mute their microphone, by the way. So which one do you think you are? Do you think you're a dog or a cat? Right? I could have you guys raise your hand. Which one do you think you are? Who thinks they're a dog? I'm probably more like a dog. All right. And anybody thinks they're a cat? All right, so some people are more like cats, right? And then there's some people a little of both. Now, this also applies to our relationship with God. There's research that shows that when you have a bad, and we've looked at the quadrant, this is the quadrant theory that someone came up with. And they said it's really about our relationship with ourselves and others. By the way, someone needs to mute their microphone. Or I can hear feedback. It's somewhat distracting. So think about dogs. Dogs, they have a really positive view of the other, but not so positive about themselves. That's why they seek the other person. Cats, on the other hand, they don't really think positively about the other person, but they think okay about themselves. And the research shows that your idea of the other person corresponds with your idea of God. So your attachment to other people can have an impact on how you relate to God. If you don't think too positively about other people, you're probably not going to think positively about yourself, about God. I do this all the time, by the way, and sometimes in therapy, I'll ask people to imagine a picture of God, right? And, and just imagine a picture of God, right? What comes up in your mind? I once had this guy say a flashlight. I'm like, what? That was new to me. I'm like, why a flashlight, right? Well, he said he'd been to prison and the security guards always carried flashlights and they would come and look in the cell. And so when he thinks of authority figures, that's what he thinks of. I'm like, wow. So his idea of God was like the security guard coming to look at him, check on him. That's probably not a really positive view, okay? So you might have a really positive view of God, but not everybody does. That's the thing I've come to realize. A lot of people have really negative attachments to God because of how the people have been in their life, So the second and third point also are key takeaways. That is, secure attachments provide a foundation for autonomy to flourish. I used to think that attachment and autonomy were opposed to each other. But when you look at Erikson, his theory, he says that you need to have that safety and security for autonomy to flourish. Imagine, for example, you're in a dating relationship, right? And your partner is very insecure. Do you think your partner is going to be more or less controlling? If they're insecure. Usually insecure partners are more likely to control and hold on to you, right? They're not going to give you autonomy. So that helps to understand how security actually creates the space for autonomy and independence to flourish, right? And the same thing with God. When we have a faith relationship with God, we understand that God is not controlling and oppressive, but actually wants to free us. He's come to set us free, not to oppress us. That's a really radical concept for a lot of people to understand. All right, and the last point I take away from Erikson is that identity comes before intimacy, right? Identity is the one that adolescents are all about. They're all about figuring out who they are. And I realize that you can't know each other if you don't know yourself. So identity must come before intimacy. And the same thing with religion. We oftentimes focus on our religious affiliation and our identity as a Christian or whatever before we really develop an intimate relationship with God, right? In my own life, I can think about how I focused on my identity as a follower of God or not. And then I started to really understand how to develop an intimate relationship with him. Okay, and when it comes to identity, James Marcia posited that we have different types of identity statuses. Some of us have, there's two axes here. Have you committed to your identity? And have you really explored your options? Some people are Christians primarily because their parents are a Christian, okay? So they haven't really explored it. So, and they might have foreclosed on it, meaning that they're already committed to it. Now, if they're just doing it because their parents did it and they haven't really thought about it, that would be known as identity diffusion. Now, some people, on the other hand, have really explored it now, but they maybe haven't really committed yet. Okay, and they're not even sure where to fall on the line, but they're still thinking about it. That would be moratorium. And lastly, are those people who've accomplished an identity, they've achieved this identity achievement. They've explored it and they've committed to it, right? And I would say this applies to many different areas of our life, which I could get into, but we don't have time. The problem, though, is that, oh, and by the way, as we get older, we move from diffusion to achievement status. So we know that from research. As we grow up, we develop a clear sense of identity. And that's really key in adolescence and especially early young adults who still oftentimes going through that. As you go through college, you're still trying to figure out who you are, right? The problem, though, is, and this is a new criticism of this, is what about middle adults who've already identified, they've gone through all the identities and they now want to just kind of be loose about it. This is where I'm at sometimes. This is called identity deconstruction. Deconstruction is usually more in middle adulthood. They're not really so stuck on their labels. Labels can be useful in the beginning. Like if you're a recovering alcoholic, say, hi, I'm an alcoholic. It helps you take the shame away from it. But you can also find that those labels can be stifling. And so sometimes we don't really want the labels, or we want to just kind of expand beyond it. And that's identity deconstruction. Sometimes those labels can be oppressive, especially when it comes to gender, like, oh, you're a man, you're a woman, right? Now you got to follow your roles, right? Sometimes we need to deconstruct what that means. Labels, when it comes to the church, can also be oppressive. Like, I'm an Adventist and you're not, right? So that becomes exclusive. That's a whole different subject we can get into, talking about church identity and the early origins of the Adventist church. That's a whole different subject I can get into. But anyway, identity deconstruction. But that wasn't really on the radar for Marcia. Okay, I know we're running out of time, but this is the last theory, okay? The last theory is James Fowler that I'm going to talk about today. James Fowler's stages of faith development builds on Piaget, Kohlberg, and Erikson. That's why I wanted to talk about those things, okay? Fowler was also influenced by Paul Tillich and Richard Niebuhr, and developed 7 formal stages of how people grow in their faith. And the biological stages are necessary, but not sufficient for progress. Basically, there's a difference between learning and maturation. Some people grow up not because they've necessarily learned anything, but because they're just growing naturally. Their bodies grow, our brains develop. But on the other hand, we also have to learn things too. And that also pushes us down our development as well. So Fowler proposed these 7 stages that are kind of like Erikson's, and also integrates the Piaget's cognitive approach as well. Okay, so it's just kind of a blend of everything. The first one is infancy. Infants develop faith. If you think about it, they have to develop faith that their caregiver is going to take care of them. In fact, you might argue that to a baby, their parent is God. Okay, I know this, and that may, challenge our thinking here, but think about it. To a baby, the parent is God. Okay, they don't have a concept of God other than their parent. That's really important. It really makes us think about how responsible we are. We reflect God to our children, right? It's a heavy responsibility. And if we don't take care of our children, or we're not responsive to their needs, they're going to think that's what God is like. Does that make sense? So it is a responsibility on parents. Infants look to parents as their God. But of course, as we get older, we have to realize that no, our parents aren't God. There's some limitations to that. Then in early childhood, they start to understand stories. They tell stories. They start to symbolize the world. They start to understand what's taboo, what's sacred. But they still have difficulty differentiating between facts and fantasies. For example, they might ask, well, if God took mommy to heaven, then I want her back. Why doesn't God bring her back? That's sad. I remember my son telling me he wants to hurry up and go to heaven. And I said, oh, no, let's not hurry up that quickly, because that means you would die. Anyway, so I'm just kidding. I mean, no, it's not like we're going to get to heaven any faster, but you know what I mean? Like this idea that he wants to go to heaven now, like, whoa, slow down. They're under there's a literal, they have a literal approach to the world. Okay. There's a mythic literal faith. So they start to have this ability to think logically that helps the growing child to order the world with categories of time, space, and causality, to empathize, understand the meaning of life, right? But sometimes they concretize these mythical elements a little too literally. For example, they might think the hell, well, and this is why I don't really believe in this idea of hell in the middle of the earth anyway, but they might think hell is literal, or they might think as, I'm just trying to think of other ideas off the top of my head. But they're going to take things literally. That's just one example. The fourth stage is adolescence. This is where they start to synthesize their beliefs and values as part of their own identity. They're starting to adopt their own identity, their own beliefs, right? But remember, adolescents are very susceptible to the sound bites of their political party or their religious faction, what we might call the advertising industry. They're not really going to critically examine as much as maybe an older adult would. Okay, so that's where young adults, they start to individuate and reflect. That's critical reflection. This is young adults and beyond. They start to critically reevaluate their beliefs and looking at their belief systems from the view of an outsider. They transition out of this naive belief system to one who's critically thought about their beliefs. And this is good. Roger Dudley, if you recall, wrote this book on why are our teenagers leaving the church. If you recall, he wrote that book, what was it, in the 90s or something like that? And I remember reading it, and he basically said the same thing, that young people have to leave sometimes because they need to figure out their own value system. If they just stay and they just adopt the values of their parents, that's a diffuse identity, right? Or foreclosed. They haven't really examined it. But young people have to they have to examine their beliefs in order to adopt it as their own, so that they know what they really believe. And then the middle adults, they're going to embrace the ambiguities and paradoxes of life. They're allowing for multiple interpretations, right? This is more the post-conventional, post-formal thinking, right? And then there's universalizing faith, as in later life, they go beyond trying to understand the paradoxes of life. Now they're just focusing on loving and devoting themselves to overcoming injustice. That's his thoughts on later life. Now, whether you agree with it or not, the problem, though, is that with Fowler, he just kind of built on some of the other theories like Piaget, but he was criticized for not really empirically testing his own theory. And as I mentioned, it doesn't really talk about so much about the more postmodern approaches, like what about people who deconstruct their identity, or they are now challenging some of the identity statuses, right? And the other problem too is that we don't always follow this neat sequence in life, right? When I look at my own life, I can see how, I'm just going to summarize it. I really identify with Erickson's approach. In my own life, I started out with a good, close understanding of God. My mom was really nice, loving. And so I had a really positive view of God because of that. But I was still very egocentric, even through adolescence. I was more focused on myself, my needs, rather than thinking about the others. So in that sense, very egocentric. But I was also, like all teenagers, trying to establish my own sense of identity. And I looked for my sense of worth and value in my work. And I realized, I don't know if I want to build my whole life purpose and identity in making money. That's why I quit IT and went into being a pastor, right? But the biggest category for me was intimacy. I realized as a young adult that we were all just playing church, and I didn't want to be just fake. I felt God actually spoke to me and said, "Are you faking your walk with God?" And I said, "Really? Is that God talking to me?" And I didn't want to be fake. I want to be genuine. Like all young adults, we talk about intimacy, right? I want to have an intimate, genuine relationship with God. And in my life, as I developed that relationship with God, I had to learn and trust that God was going to provide for me, right? He took care of me financially. I had to trust that he's going to lead. Sometimes I didn't know where I was going. I had to trust in his power. I had to learn to think positively that God was going to help me. I had to trust that God loved the people that I loved when they died. I was really sad about it, but I had to trust that God loved them and was compassionate. I had to trust that God would heal. I struggled with my own habits, not letting, I would hold on to my own habits because I didn't trust that God was going to help me heal. So I had to learn to trust that God could heal me. And then I had to learn to trust that God wanted me to be happy. I remember when I was searching for a girlfriend, I thought that I had to do it all on my own. I had to trust that God wanted my happiness and he loved me too. And I had to trust that he had better plans and that he could help me see the beauty in the world around us. And now today, I feel like I'm in the generativity stage, right? For me, I find the greatest connection when I'm serving him in ministry. I feel fulfilled. But I think the danger there is I realize that you can easily put your identity in that too. So I have had to learn to just kind of stop being the change agent of the world and just trust that, my happiness is in him. I don't always have to be in ministry, serving and doing stuff. I can just allow God to heal and change the world and love me too, because I'm also important to God as well. And as I think about that, I think that's preparing me for the end of life too, because there's going to be a time when I'm going to die and I can't continue to minister forever. And we have to learn to stop trying to perform and just allow God to love us too. So that's it. I'm sorry, there's a lot of stuff to cover, but I hope that was helpful for you.